The morning sun slipped gently through the tall glass windows of the mansion, filling the grand rooms with a golden glow. The maid moved softly across the polished marble floors, her hands busy arranging cushions, dusting shelves, and ensuring every corner looked flawless before the family awoke. Her work was quiet, almost invisible, yet each detail mattered to her. She treated the house as if it were her own, even though her presence was often overlooked. Today felt no different, but a slight heaviness lingered in the air, as though something unexpected was about to unfold. Upstairs, the millionaire's daughter stirred in her enormous bed, surrounded by silk sheets and expensive comforts, yet her mood was far from peaceful. She awoke restless, her face tight with irritation, though nothing had happened to disturb her. She threw aside the blanket and walked toward the mirror, frowning at her reflection as if the day itself had already betrayed her. Down below, the maid straightened the breakfast table with practiced care, her thoughts calm but her body already weary from the long list of tasks that lay ahead. The silence of the morning was broken only by the soft clatter of dishes, but soon that silence would be interrupted by footsteps descending the staircase. The mansion, so quiet and perfect in appearance, held a secret tension within its walls. The maid, though used to carrying burdens in silence, could not sense the storm that was slowly rising in the heart of the young daughter upstairs. It would be a morning like no other, a morning when invisible lines between wealth and humility would begin to blur. What seemed like an ordinary start was quietly turning into the beginning of a story no one in the house would ever forget. The dining room gleamed with elegance, the long wooden table polished to perfection and decorated with silver cutlery that caught the light of the morning sun. The maid moved carefully, balancing the breakfast tray in her hands, making sure nothing spilled as she placed the dishes before the millionaire's daughter. She bowed her head slightly, as she always did, and stepped back quietly, hoping her work would go unnoticed. But the daughter, already restless from the moment she had woken, glanced at her with sharp eyes. Without much thought, she let out a careless remark about the maid's appearance, words spoken with the ease of someone who had never considered how deep they might cut. The maid froze for a second, her hands tightening against the tray she still held. Her eyes lowered, not daring to meet the gaze of the young girl sitting before her, and though she had heard such words many times, this one seemed to weigh heavier than usual. A faint shadow crossed her face, one of hurt and sadness, but she quickly hid it, forcing herself to move as if nothing had happened. The daughter smirked lightly, satisfied with her remark, but the room itself seemed to grow colder in that moment, as if it had taken notice of the cruelty that had slipped into the air. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft clinking of a spoon against porcelain, and though the maid tried to steady her breath, her chest felt tight. Something unseen was shifting within the walls of the mansion, a quiet storm gathering strength, though neither of them realized that every word spoken now would echo louder than they could imagine in the hours to come. It was only the beginning, but the atmosphere had already begun to change. The day stretched on inside the grand mansion, but the warmth of the morning had long disappeared. The maid worked steadily, dusting shelves, carrying trays, and straightening every room, yet each time she crossed paths with the millionaire's daughter, another comment slipped from the young girl's lips. At first it was about the maid's clothes, then her hands, then the way she walked, small remarks, but each one sharper than the last, like thorns pressed deeper with every passing hour. The maid lowered her head each time, swallowing her pride and saying nothing, for she knew her position depended on silence. Yet silence, instead of softening the daughter, seemed to encourage her, as though the lack of resistance gave her more power. By midday, the remarks had turned into subtle jabs that lingered long after they were spoken, words that clung to the air like shadows. The maid carried on with her duties, but her movements grew slower, her shoulders heavier, her eyes clouded with a sadness she tried to hide. The daughter, however, felt a strange thrill at having control, her arrogance growing bolder with every unchallenged word. The mansion, though beautiful and filled with light, seemed to close in around them, its halls echoing with an invisible tension that no one could name. Servants who passed through sensed the unease, but none dared to interfere. The maid's silence was not weakness, but strength, yet the daughter could not see it. She mistook quiet endurance for submission, unaware that her every word was weaving a rope that would soon tighten around her own pride. As evening crept closer, the air inside the house grew heavier, and though neither spoke of it, a feeling lingered something was about to break, and when it did, nothing would remain the same. The evening promised to be grand, and the mansion buzzed with quiet movement as the staff hurried through the halls, each one focused on preparing for the important gathering. The maid, though already tired from the long day, pushed herself harder, polishing glasses until they gleamed, arranging flowers with delicate care, and setting every plate in perfect alignment. Her hands moved swiftly but gracefully, each task done with the hope that nothing would be out of place when the guests arrived. Yet despite her effort, the millionaire's daughter hovered nearby, her sharp eyes catching even the smallest things. A napkin slightly tilted, a candle not centered, a vase positioned an inch too far. None escaped her notice, and none were forgiven. With every correction, her tone grew colder, her words more cutting. The maid nodded silently, adjusting and readjusting, though her heart ached with the weight of constant criticism. The other servants exchanged glances, sensing the rising tension, but daring not to speak. As the clock ticked closer to the hour, the daughter's frustration swelled. She wanted perfection, not because the guests demanded it, but because her pride demanded nothing less. At last, her patience broke, and her voice rose sharply, echoing across the room as she scolded the maid for an imagined mistake. The sudden outburst startled the servants, and for the first time, the humiliation unfolded in front of watching eyes. The maid's face flushed, not with anger, but with quiet shame, as she bent to correct the so-called flaw. The air turned heavy, the glitter of the grand hall dimmed by the weight of her raised voice. What should have been a celebration carried with it an undercurrent of unease, as though the walls themselves were witnesses to a cruelty that could not remain hidden much longer. The grand hall glittered with light, the tables shining with crystal and silver, and the servants moving quickly to complete the final touches before the evening guests arrived. The maid, weary but steady, adjusted a centerpiece one last time, her fingers trembling slightly from the long hours of work. The millionaire's daughter stood nearby, her arms crossed, her gaze sharp and restless, every detail feeding her impatience. For a moment she simply watched, but then, with a voice louder than necessary, she spoke words that sliced through the air, words not about a misplaced item or a crooked cloth, but about the maid herself. Her remark was not careless this time. It was deliberate, meant to belittle, meant to remind everyone present that the maid, in her eyes, was nothing more than a servant with no real worth. The sound of her voice carried across the room, and at once the air shifted. Conversations among the staff stilled, the quiet shuffling of feet froze, and all eyes turned toward the scene unfolding before them. The maid's hands trembled around the vase she held, though she kept her head bowed, refusing to let the tears burning behind her eyes spill out. Her silence was heavy, but it spoke louder than words. The daughter smirked faintly, mistaking the lack of response for victory. But the silence in the room was not one of agreement, it was the silence of shock. The atmosphere grew thick, pressing against everyone's chest, as if even the walls were holding their breath. The maid forced her hands to steady, determined not to drop the fragile glass. Yet her heart felt as though it might shatter instead. A line had been crossed, and though no one moved, it was clear that something irreversible had just happened. The room still carried the weight of silence after the daughter's cruel remark, and the maid stood frozen, clutching the vase in her trembling hands. None of the servants dared to speak, their eyes lowered, yet the tension in the air was so thick it was almost suffocating. What the daughter did not notice, too wrapped in her own pride, was the tall figure that had quietly appeared in the doorway. Her father, the millionaire himself, had entered without announcement, his polished shoes making no sound on the marble floor. At first, he looked puzzled, his brows slightly furrowed as he tried to understand why the room felt so heavy, why every servant looked uneasy. His eyes then settled on his daughter, standing with arrogance in her posture, and on the maid, who struggled to steady her shaking hands. His confusion turned into realization as he recalled the sharp words he had just overheard, each one cutting through the respectful quiet of the mansion. The longer he stood there, the more his face changed, shock flickered across his features, and then a deep disappointment settled in his eyes, a disappointment that seemed heavier than anger. He did not speak immediately, but the silence of his presence alone carried weight, a silent judgment hanging in the air. The daughter, still unaware of him, straightened her dress proudly, thinking she had won her unspoken battle. But her father's gaze never left her, cold and steady, as though he was seeing her in a way he never had before. The servants noticed him standing there, their eyes widening slightly, but none dared to reveal his presence. The room felt like a stage about to witness its most important moment, and the daughter, blind to her audience, had no idea her actions had just rewritten the way her father saw her. A heavy silence had already settled across the room, but when the father finally cleared his throat, the sound struck through the air like a sudden clap of thunder. Every servant froze in place, their movements halting mid-step, their eyes dropping to the floor, as if afraid to breathe too loudly. The daughter's proud stance faltered instantly, her confidence draining from her face as she turned toward the doorway. Her eyes widened, and the color left her cheeks the moment she saw her father standing there, his gaze fixed firmly upon her. In that instant, she knew he had heard everything. Panic stirred inside her chest, but no excuse formed on her lips. The silence between them felt too sharp, too heavy to break. The maid, on the other hand, lowered her eyes even further, her trembling hands clutching the edge of the table as though bracing herself for blame that might fall unfairly on her. She had no voice in this house, and even now, she did not expect to be defended. The father took a single step forward, his presence commanding without a word, and the tension in the room deepened. The daughter's heart pounded wildly, regret flashing through her mind too late, for she could already see the disappointment etched across her father's face. The servants held their breath, waiting for what would follow, as if the entire mansion itself had paused to witness the unfolding moment. The father's silence spoke volumes before he even opened his mouth, and the daughter realized that nothing she could say now would erase what he had heard. The maid, though quiet and still, felt the shift in the air. The balance of power in the room was no longer where it had been, and something was about to change forever. The daughter stood frozen, her heart pounding so loudly she could almost hear it echo in her ears, while the maid kept her eyes fixed on the floor, praying the moment would pass without further humiliation. Then, in a voice steady yet unshakably firm, the father finally spoke. His tone was calm, but it carried a weight that silenced even the faintest sound in the room. He did not raise his voice, nor did he show anger, but every word he spoke seemed carved with authority. He looked directly at his daughter, and with quiet strength reminded her that wealth was never meant to be a weapon, that privilege did not give her the right to belittle or disrespect another human being. The servants, still standing in tense silence, felt each word as though they were lessons for them too, though they already knew the truth he was trying to teach. The daughter's throat tightened, her pride shrinking under the sharp light of his disappointment. For the first time, she felt the weight of her actions, not just as careless words spoken in arrogance, but as choices that revealed something far deeper about her character. The father's voice softened slightly as he added that true greatness was not measured by money or status, but by kindness and respect. The maid's eyes glistened, though she kept them lowered, touched not just by his defense, but by the rare acknowledgement of her dignity. The daughter, trembling inwardly, wanted to look away but could not escape his gaze. His calmness made his words more powerful than anger ever could, and in that moment she understood that she had crossed a line that her father would never allow her to cross again. The lesson had been spoken, and it would not be forgotten. The father's words settled over the room like a quiet storm, firm yet filled with meaning, and for the first time that evening, the maid felt seen. She had stood silently through the sharp remarks and cold glances, swallowing every sting without complaint, but now something inside her began to tremble. Her eyes filled slowly with tears, not from weakness, but from the rare moment of being defended, of having her worth acknowledged in a house where she was often invisible. She quickly lowered her head, hoping to hide the emotion, but the shimmer of tears was already noticed by those around her. The father, his expression still calm but touched with gentleness, turned his gaze toward her and spoke words she had almost forgotten how to hear. He thanked her for her hard work, for the countless hours she gave to keep the home running smoothly, for the patience she showed even when faced with unkindness. It was not loud praise, not dramatic, but it carried a sincerity that struck deeper than anything else. The servants nearby shifted quietly, moved by the rare sight, for they too knew the burden she carried in silence. The daughter, pale and shaken, looked on as her father gave the respect she had so carelessly taken away. The maid tried to steady herself, biting the inside of her cheek to keep from crying, but her tears slipped down anyway, glistening under the soft light of the room. For her, those words were more valuable than any gift of gold, because they were words of dignity, words that reminded her she was more than just a shadow in the mansion. The moment hung in the air, fragile yet powerful, and everyone knew the balance of the room had shifted forever. The daughter stood in the center of the room, her chest tight and her hands trembling slightly at her sides, while her father's words echoed in her mind. Embarrassment burned her cheeks, but beneath it lay something deeper, a growing awareness she could no longer ignore. For the first time, she truly looked at the maid not through the lens of wealth and status, not as someone meant to serve her every need, but as a human being. She saw the tired lines on the maid's face, the calloused hands that had worked endlessly, the quiet strength it took to endure sharp words without ever answering back. The image unsettled her, shaking the foundation of the arrogance she had carried for so long. Each careless remark she had thrown earlier replayed in her mind, now sounding crueler than she had ever realized, and with every memory came a pang of guilt that pierced her pride. The silence in the room seemed to press against her chest, making it harder to breathe, and though no one spoke, she felt the weight of many eyes on her. She realized she had not only wounded the maid, but she had shamed herself before everyone present. Her father's disappointment was heavy enough, but the look of quiet dignity in the maid's tearful eyes struck even harder, forcing her to confront the truth. She had mistaken silence for weakness, but now she understood that it was strength, a strength she herself did not possess. For the first time, felt small not because of money or position, but because she saw clearly how little kindness she had shown. And as this realization sank deeper, she knew something within her would never be the same again. The daughter stood frozen, her throat dry and her thoughts tangled, as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. Pride clawed at her, urging her to stay silent, to pretend nothing had happened. Yet guilt pushed harder, demanding that she face the truth she had tried to ignore. Her father remained still, his eyes fixed on her, not rushing, not speaking, only waiting with the patience of someone who knew that silence could be more powerful than words. The pause stretched, making her heart pound faster, as if every second without speech exposed her more. She glanced at the maid, who stood quietly, her hands folded in front of her, her expression unreadable. The maid had endured so much already, and still, she gave nothing away, no demand for justice, no plea for kindness, only the same steady silence that had carried her through years of service. The daughter's lips parted, but no words came out, and shame burned hotter in her chest. Around them, the servants kept their heads lowered, though every ear listened for the sound of her voice, uncertain whether she would ever speak. The father's calm patience made the silence heavier, as though the whole house held its breath, waiting for her choice. Deep inside, the daughter felt the crack in her pride widening, a painful but necessary breaking. The guilt was stronger now, pulling her toward words she had never spoken so sincerely before. She shifted uneasily, her voice trembling on the edge of release, her pride fighting its last desperate battle against the weight of her conscience. And though the apology had not yet left her lips, it hovered in the air, fragile and uncertain, a promise that something long overdue was finally about to be said. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable, and then, at last, the daughter drew in a shaky breath and let the words slip out. Her voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard it, stripped of arrogance and sharpness, trembling with hesitation. She stumbled at first, unsure of how to begin, but then the apology came simple, imperfect, yet sincere. Every syllable carried the weight of shame and regret. And though her words were not polished, they revealed something true. She was sorry. The room seemed to soften as the tension broke, and for a brief moment, no one moved, as though they were afraid the fragile honesty might shatter if disturbed. The maid lifted her gaze slightly, her tired eyes glistening as she studied the young girl who had once looked down on her. Then, with a quiet grace that surprised no one who knew her gentle spirit, she gave a small nod. Forgiveness came easily to her, not because she had forgotten the hurt, but because bitterness had no place in her heart. That simple gesture spoke louder than 1,000 words, carrying with it a strength that silenced the room in reverence. The daughter blinked rapidly, her chest tightening as she realized her apology had been accepted without anger, without coldness, only with kindness she felt she did not deserve. Her father, still watching closely, allowed the moment to settle, his stern face softening ever so slightly as he recognized the shift taking place. The servants glanced at one another, moved by the rare sight of humility and forgiveness sharing the same space. It was not a grand speech, nor a dramatic display, but a quiet exchange that held more power than anything else that could have been said. Something had changed forever, and everyone felt it. The room, once heavy with tension, began to feel different, as though the air itself had shifted after the apology was spoken and forgiveness was quietly given. The servants, who had been holding their breath in silence, now moved with more ease, though their eyes still lingered on the scene as if afraid to miss the change unfolding. The daughter, her heart still pounding, felt a strange lightness inside her, though the weight of shame had not yet left. She knew she could not erase the words she had spoken or the hurt she had caused, but for the first time, she felt the door had opened, chance to become someone better than the person who had stood there hours earlier. She looked at the maid with new eyes, not as a figure meant to serve her, but as someone deserving of respect, someone who had carried dignity even in silence. The maid, though quiet, carried herself differently too, as though the simple acknowledgement of her worth had given her strength. The father watched it all with careful eyes, his sternness softening into something warmer. A faint smile touched his lips, not one of pride in perfection, but of relief in progress. He knew this was only the first step, but it was a step in the right direction, and that was enough for now. The daughter lowered her gaze, still ashamed, but no longer trapped in arrogance, and the faintest spark of humility began to grow inside her. The atmosphere no longer felt like a battlefield of pride and silence. It had become a space of learning and quiet hope. The father, standing tall and calm, allowed himself to breathe easier, knowing the lesson had begun to take root in the heart that needed it most. The days that followed carried a quiet shift in the household, subtle at first, but noticeable to those who paid attention. The daughter, once quick to mock and criticize, began to hold her tongue, and in moments when she might have turned away, she instead chose to step closer. She started with the smallest gestures, passing a plate, holding open a door, or helping to carry a tray when the maid's arms were already full. They were tasks she had never imagined herself doing, but each act chipped away at the wall she had built between them. The maid, cautious at first, accepted these efforts with a calm grace, watching carefully to see if this kindness would last or fade like a passing mood. The daughter, for her part, was not acting out of guilt alone. She felt a genuine need to prove, not only to her father and the maid, but also to herself, that she was capable of change. The silence that once carried tension now began to carry something gentler, an unspoken understanding forming between them. There were moments when their eyes met, and though no words were exchanged, the look held more weight than any insult or apology ever could. Trust did not come instantly. The maid had lived too long under the sharpness of careless remarks to believe in sudden transformation. Yet, slowly, with every kind act repeated, with every small effort made without complaint, her heart began to open, and she started to believe that the change was real. The father, watching from the background, noticed a difference, and though he said little, his eyes revealed his quiet approval. What had once been a house divided by pride and silence was now becoming a place where respect and kindness, fragile but growing, began to take root. As the evening settled and the mansion grew quiet, the father found himself deep in thought, replaying every moment that had unfolded before his eyes. He had seen his daughter cross a line he never wished her to, but he had also watched her take her first steps back toward humility, a path that could change the course of her life. Sitting in his study, he reflected on how fragile respect can be, and how easily it can be broken with a careless word. Yet he also knew that mistakes, even painful ones, could become powerful teachers if one had the courage to face them honestly. He thought of the maid, whose silent endurance had carried more strength than any wealth could buy, and he silently admired her quiet dignity. He thought of his daughter, who had begun to see that pride built walls, while kindness built bridges. It struck him that true worth was never found in riches, fine clothes, or glittering gatherings, but in the way one treated another human being, no matter their position. The daughter, though still carrying the weight of her shame, now walked with a new awareness in her heart. She had spoken words of apology, taken steps of kindness, and for the first time, she truly understood the value of respect. The father knew this lesson would stay with her forever, etched into her memory, not by his wealth or authority, but by the silence of a maid's tears and the strength of a simple truth. As he closed his eyes that night, he felt a quiet relief, knowing his daughter had learned something that even all his riches could not teach, that the measure of a person is not what they own, but how they honor the lives of those around them.